Hi folks, Keenan here over at Tales of Kaimere. I am a scientific illustrator and fantasy author. I'm way behind on my next Tales of Kaimere anthology, so I'm shifting my schedule around a little bit. For the next 2 weeks, I will be doing a Q&A to both save time on art and to show some appreciation for my Patreon supporters. My Patreon account is just for support and offers no exclusive features, since I don't want a paywall preventing folks from enjoying this project. That said, I do have bills to pay, and I'm very grateful for the support my patrons offer. Sponsorships and ad revenue also help, of course, and that's a great way to support the project, but I thought I'd devote these next 2 weeks to my supporters on Patreon. Without further ado, let's dive in. Gage Weber asks, what do you most look forward to in covering the future of Kaimere? That's a tough one. Kaimere is very intentionally a project that has elements of all of my interests. Diverse and engaging creatures, ecology, paleontology, anthropology, history, and political intrigue. It's a project where there's always something I can develop depending on my current interests and inspiration, a useful aspect for someone with ADHD. That said, I'm really excited to explore more regions beyond the known world. Each offers essentially a little independent project. Not only is that helping me refine my design process, which will be critical once I start developing the Analogoterra projects that explores planets beyond Kaimere, but also in populating the rest of the world, which will of course influence the creatures and ecology of the known world, where most of my writing takes place. I'm also very excited to develop the first dynasty more, which is the topic of my very first episode next year. The GBZard asks, I want to ask if you've ever planned on making a Discord server for Kaimere or something like that. Also, will the polar continent ever be covered in its own episode? Great question. It's something that I've looked into, but if I want to make an official Discord, I will need to moderate it pretty closely. I am extremely pressed for time between the channel, commissions, and writing, and moderating a server while engaging in official answers to queries is more than I can take on at this time. I've considered a Patreon-only Discord with the idea that the payments I get there could effectively pay for the time spent. I know creators who do this and like it. My reservation is, as I've discussed before, I don't want to withhold information on the project behind a paywall. I want Kaimere to be accessible to all. Might make it an open access server once I reach a certain monthly level on Patreon. I've heard talk of an unofficial Discord, which I do fully support, but I don't have it in me to moderate one at this time. As for the North Polar Continent, I don't yet have a sponsor for it, but would absolutely be open to exploring the topic. Ian Pendleton asks, what's the longest amount of time that a portal has gone without any harvests from Earth? That would be the first dynasty. Attentive viewers will remember me saying that other dynasties have been the longest, but the first dynasty lasted for the better part of 100 million years until the planet became arid and an asteroid impact annihilated the most dominant clades. That's definitely the longest period without harvest, at least after the harvests started. Anonymous asks, when did the Assembly first start working with Chimerans? For those who don't know, the Assembly is a decentralized organization on Earth dedicated to keeping Kaimere and supernatural beings such as witches, shapeshifters, and vampires of Earth a secret. They do other things like study magic and support their own, but mostly their priority is secrecy. In modern times, this mostly involves having members in many branches of government, law enforcement, the private sector, academics, and religious organizations. This could easily be a video topic in its own right, but I will try to keep it brief. The Assembly, as it operates today, has only been around for a few centuries. Prior to that, there were several organizations throughout the world in the forms of cults, orders, societies, and other groups operating to keep supernatural beings safe. Secrecy wasn't always that important, which is why so many myths and legends that are consistent with not only witches, but also of Kaimere, which went in many number of names such as Otherworld or Fairy Realm. At times, supernatural beings were rulers, but for the most part they were feared. Witch trials are often cited by the Assembly as a driving force toward secrecy in recent centuries, though the effort for secrecy long predates the most famous hunts in regions like Scotland or the Holy Roman Empire. Maintaining an ironclad grip on secrecy just isn't viable, especially in a modern era with all the technology we have at hand. Associating magic with entertainment has helped a lot. The Assembly claims that exposing magic to the public in such overt ways as cinema, games, and even this YouTube channel have helped keep the secrecy by hiding it in plain sight and allowing whistleblowers to be ridiculed rather than have any extreme measures like assassination or mind control. While there have been some intentional initiatives to present magic as fiction like this one, the Assembly can't actually take credit for modern society's perception and dismissal of the supernatural. At the end of the day, the Assembly is just kind of lucky in that respect. As for working with Chimerans, during the Mercantile Age 3,000 years ago, Chimerans traded with humans worldwide, though primarily in the Mediterranean and Mesoamerica. In this sense, this is when the relationship began. A disastrous plague in Kaimere followed these interactions. In an effort to avoid contamination that might follow discovery, an urgency for secrecy so we don't find their world and bring more plagues was undertaken. Chimerans have gone through great lengths to suppress knowledge and artifacts from being linked to them. While they have a practical reason for secrecy, it has been theorized that part of the reason that enchanted peoples of Earth also chose secrecy is unintentionally influenced by these Chimeran precedents. Chimeran and supernatural organizations have worked together for thousands of years. This secrecy has meant common people don't have access to understanding of magic beyond rumor and conjecture, so that when they do have encounters of magical people, it is often reacted to with fear of the unknown. Speculator asks, do any of the Fabodont tetrapods still exist, or are they totally extinct? For those who don't know, the Fabodonts are a clade of tetrapod that evolved during the First Dynasty. In this 100 million year stretch without harvests, Kaimere developed at least 6 entirely new classes of organisms unique to the planet. Fabodonts, so named for their bean-shaped batteries of teeth, weren't especially dominant during the dynasty, but did quite well for themselves in the temperate regions due to an endothermic metabolism. Though they did alright during the First Dynasty, the following era saw them absolutely dominate the polar continents. Though they've had numerous families go extinct, there are still Fabodonts in Kaishel, and I have plans for them in a few other places beyond the known world as well. Colby Collins asks, seeing as how fauna from South American harvests had an advantage in dealing with dinosaurs due to enduring terror birds in their ecosystem, would the same be said if the portal had harvested from southern US around 2.8 million years ago during the height of the reign of Titanus, in which animals, would you wager, would do best in this context of the known world's history? I must confess pretty substantial ignorance surrounding the Pliocene. I have read a lot of articles and papers in the region and eras of the harvests. As there were no Pliocene harvests, I haven't studied the era that much. I like to study beyond the immediate scope of harvest, since a given formation isn't going to tell you the whole story, and there's always going to be ghost lineages or wider ranges than we can account for, given the fragmentary snapshots a formation can provide. Titanus is actually a pretty relevant example here. There aren't any preserved terror birds of the size and niche of the fireback and other large terror birds in the late Miocene harvest. The fireback is descended from animals not preserved in the fossil record. A hypothetical South American ancestor of Titanus around 1 million years before the earliest examples of Titanus fossils show up in North America. As I understand it, Titanus was an apex predator of open forests. While Smilodon is often touted as outcompeting terror birds, it seems saber-toothed cats only got large again, as they had back in the Miocene, after terror birds declined in the end of the Pliocene. While Titanus and Smilodon aren't in Kaimere, I did a fair bit of research in the early dynamics, since the archetype and body plans are represented even if the genera are not. To circle back to your question, I haven't studied Titanus and its sympatric fauna that much, but I understand the region was more arid than Miocene South America, whereas Kaimere was still quite humid during the anchored period, which would probably be a greater factor in the success or failure of the biota in a given harvest than of being predisposed to defend theropod predation. They also have much longer to adapt to predators with color vision than presumably extended into the ultraviolet spectrum. However, I do think that a few million years of evolution alongside Titanus would have given the artiodactyls and carnivorans a competitive advantage in the known world compared to those which came in the Pleistocene of Asia. If a harvest of these clades had occurred in Pliocene North America, it may well have been more successful and stable to the point that Pleistocene harvests wouldn't have occurred. The harvest 1.5 million years ago wasn't entirely faunal driven, but it was so long and widespread because it triggered intense competition. If the deer and derived carnivoran niches had been established back in the Pliocene, the harvest would not have been as large and I expect not nearly as devastating. If Homo erectus hadn't been included, since they were pretty rare and only harvested in large quantities due to the scope of the first Pleistocene harvest, then the European harvest in the Middle Pleistocene certainly wouldn't have happened, as that was triggered specifically by human activity. Well, that was a long one, and I think we will stop there. I have plenty more questions to get to, so that will be our topic for next week. If you'd like to support me on Patreon and get a question in for next week, I would deeply appreciate it. You can comment on Patreon post about the Q&A, or send me your query over Patreon Messenger. I'd love it if you could continue to support the project, but if you are only in a position to join for 1 month to enter your question, I completely understand. Watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting on these videos is a fantastic way to bring my project to new viewers, and the ads really do go a long way in making ends meet and enabling me to make more videos. Thanks again, see you next week for part 2. Cheers, folks!